I am Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the Vatican, it belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow, it belongs to everyone. I rejected those answers. Instead, I chose something different. I chose the impossible. I chose Rapture. A city where the artist would not fear the censor, where the scientist would not be bound by petty morality, where the great would not be constrained by the small. And with the sweat of your brow, Rapture can become your city as well.
Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J, and welcome to Through the Looking Glass, where I take a look at older games I've never played before to see if they still hold up. In this video, would you kindly pull up a chair as we dive into the original Bioshock? Now this is a game that people have talked at great length about. A game that stood out to many for being very profound in its setting, atmosphere, and story. Dystopia is always interesting to think about and read about, but this allowed us to live in it. We weren't just reading about what was going on, though there were plenty of audio diaries to provide context. We were there, stuck in the action, and forced to wrestle with these ideas of what makes us human, what that truly means, and what caused Rapture to fall to ruin. The gameplay was almost never the center focus of anything that I heard about the game, but there was also a major deviation in the gameplay due to the mysterious substance known as Atom. Through this atom, humans could essentially give themselves superpowers, at the seeming cost of being driven insane. You are Jack, a silent protagonist who is unexpectedly thrown into Rapture after a plane crash brings him to the entrance of the underwater city. Upon finding a radio, you are introduced to Atlas, the leader of a group of renegades trying to get out of Rapture and bring down Andrew Ryan on the way. Your goal is to help Atlas find his family and try to get out of Rapture yourself. Along the way, you find audio diaries scattered around the environment, which can reveal more about the character's motivations, the world itself, and so much more. This is one of my favorite ways of giving the player story, as it doesn't interrupt the gameplay while still giving us plenty to listen to. The number of actual characters you meet in-game is fairly limited, however, which means your radio is your primary means of listening to and interacting with others. All of the characters are interesting in their own right, mostly because all of them are flawed, wounded, and are driven by something. Atlas has his wife and son driving him to rescue them. Ryan is determined to uphold the ideals of his city, going so far as to release pheromones into the air which causes the insane atom users, called splicers, to attack anyone labeled as a parasite, someone who would bring harm to their little utopia. You also learn about this criminal called Fontaine, who had tried to rule Rapture through its underbelly, outpacing the production of Atom and serving as a foil to Ryan's view of the city. The most interesting character to me, though, is Tenenbaum, the creator and, to some extent, adopted mother of the Little Sisters. In case you're unfamiliar with them, I'll let Atlas fill you in.
You think that's a child down there? Don't be fooled. She's a little sister now. Somebody went and turned a sweet baby girl into a monster. Whatever you thought about right and wrong on the surface, well, that don't count for much down in Rapture. Those little sisters, they carry Atom, the genetic material that keeps the wheels of Rapture turning. Everybody wants it, everybody needs it.
Essentially, there were these sea slugs that were found to be good at producing Atom, but when bound to a host, they produce a lot more. Unfortunately, the best hosts for these sea slugs were young girls, hence the Little Sisters. Tenenbaum is so fascinating to me because she's not the kind of character that most video games, hell, most media in general, are brave enough to show. In today's climate surrounding gaming media, a character like Tenenbaum couldn't exist. She has a conscience and is displeased whenever you harm her little ones, but she also worked for the Nazis in Holocaust prison camps. She made the Little Sisters in the first place, and she fully admits herself that she's perverted what it means to be a mother. She's wounded, flawed, and a tragic character in her own right, and getting a female character like that is so rare. In order to talk more about the story and its effectiveness, however, I will need to venture into spoiler territory. So would you kindly skip away if you haven't seen it? Unless you want to know what happens, in which case carry on at your own risk, but don't say I didn't warn you. First, let's start with my major gripe with the story, the 3 endings. Depending on how you treat the Little Sisters, you get a different outcome after the final boss fight. That's all well and good, nothing wrong there, But the problem is that it's very obvious which one is canon and which isn't. With the good ending, it makes sense that Tenenbaum and the Little Sisters would want to help you out, as you've been helping them, and the end is very satisfying. However, even if you've been harvesting the item from every Little Sister you come across, killing them in the process, you still end up being rescued at one point by Tenenbaum, and are helped by the Little Sisters despite her clear animosity towards you. Not only that, but if you do the math, it's technically more rewarding to save the Little Sisters than it is to harvest them for all the item they have. The whole point of that moral choice was to make us take a hit in exchange for what will end up being a better ending. But then it turns out that moral choice helps you out more in the long run. I suppose you reap what you sow, the sweat of your brow and all that fun stuff, but knowing that, it completely takes away from the moral dilemma and the good ending doesn't feel as rewarding. It doesn't feel like you truly made the sacrifice to help others if you know that critical information. But what I really put the spoiler warning up for is the main tipping point in the story. I knew going in that the main character was basically a genetically engineered baby of some sort, and related to Andrew Ryan. Even though I knew about that plot point, they built it up hard, and the delivery was really good. It's important to understand this because I thought, having schooled myself on that plot point, there was nothing new to be told. Everything was effective, but then there was something I either hadn't heard or had simply forgotten. I really should have expected Atlas to be an alias for Fontaine, but I didn't, and I will admit the entire sequence with Andrew Ryan's death, how they built up Fontaine taking over, and everything about that just made the whole game worth it. I had been having problems getting into the game, but it was at that moment that I realized what people truly loved about it. I think the only moment that comes closest to this is a moment with Sander Cohen, an artist gone mad, when he sends a bunch of splicers after you and pairs it with classical music. That juxtaposition was too perfect. Are you finally gonna come out and face me? Where are you? Oh, come on! Are you really gonna juxtapose this? I can't even be mad at this. This is just so out there. What the hell is this? Not the bees! No! Ow! Oh good, the bees are going after other people now. I am smiling! Oh, this juxtaposition's perfect. I love it. Zap! And whack. The gameplay isn't as enthralling or great as the story and atmosphere, but it does a decent job in its own right. Before I go too far, I'm gonna say it right now, the gunplay ain't that good. Part of this is because I went into the game right after playing Half-Life 2, which was a mistake. But at the same time, it's also helped me remind myself what makes good gunplay to begin with. At least to me, it comes down to usability. Is it easy to pick up on, aim, and use the guns provided to me? With Half-Life 2, everything is sharp, accurate, and every time I miss, I know it's my fault. But here, not so much. I suspect that there's some mouse acceleration in the game, as I could never find a sensitivity that I liked. On top of that, it seems that whenever I manually adjusted the field of view, it misaligned the visual indicators with the hitbox, especially when it came to using the wrench, which serves as your melee weapon. Fortunately, the game does a lot more surrounding the gunplay to make up for the faults, primarily with the use of Atom. By finding or purchasing different plasmids and tonics, you are able to give yourself an array of passive buffs and active abilities. The tonics act as your passives, and come in 3 forms. Combat tonics give you increased damage, resistance to damage, and are primarily used for, well, combat. Engineering tonics make it easier to manipulate or destroy the machinery you encounter. Physical tonics allow you to better take advantage of some items you find throughout the world, such as improving first aid kits, allowing you to gain health back on taking certain actions, and increasing movement speed. The plasmids act as your actives, giving you a second means of tackling enemies. They typically don't do as much damage as your weapons, at least not on their own, but can do a variety of generally unpleasant things to your enemies. Would you like to burn them, shock them, freeze them, send out a decoy, or maybe just set them on each other and break out the popcorn? Different enemies will also be stronger or weaker against different elements, adding a bit of rock, paper, scissors into the mix. The plasmids are also your primary way to interact with the environment, as water can be zapped to seriously damage all enemies in them, and oil slick works in a similar fashion for fire. What you pull off of the enemy's bodies has a tangible impact on your resource management, as there is an in-game economy that you need to worry about. You will find ammo for both your weapons and Eve, the plasmid resource, lying around. To further complicate things, there are 3 different ammo types for your guns, which are proficient at taking on certain enemies. Some of these are standard fare, such as anti-armor or anti-personnel, but others, such as the shotgun's electric and explosive buck, can serve as backup plasmids for different elemental effects, as well as dealing heavy damage. You will also find miscellaneous items lying around which can help or hurt you. Food heals a slight amount, alcoholic drinks heal a bit but at the cost of Eve, coffee helps both, cigarettes take health in exchange for Eve, and some food helps both. This usually doesn't have a big effect on the game, but it's a nice touch, even if it means mass clicking on everything is a little more inconvenient than it should be. Just keep an eye on how much you drink, as you don't want to go fighting right after a few rounds. If you can't find what you need lying around though, there are 3 different resources at your disposal. The first is the money you find, which can be spent at vending machines and some other places to get more first aid kits, Eve refills, ammo, and so on. The second is miscellaneous scrap you find throughout the game, which can be taken to a UN vent to create certain items. Finally, there is the atom itself, which can only be collected by interacting with the Little Sisters. In order to do that, however, you have to defeat the Big Daddy that guards her, and then you have a decision to make. Save that little sister but give up on some atom, or harvest them for more atom but kill them in the process. This atom can be spent at the Gatherer's Garden to give you more slots for plasmids and tonics, more things to put in those slots, as well as some of their improved versions. Even if all of these encouragements to explore aren't good enough, there is also a small, albeit repetitive, hacking minigame, where you try and get fluid from one end to another without an issue. By doing this, you can reduce vending machine prices, have security cameras and sentries help you, and overall just make things easier. Just remember to keep the electro bolt handy if you plan on doing this a lot, as it's the only way that you can safely approach the sentries or security cameras without either getting a face full of bullets or triggering a security alarm. You also get a camera early in the game, which allows you to take pictures of enemies you encounter. There is some risk to this, but it fits nicely with the risk-reward structure throughout the game. Getting a close-up picture while they're still alive means you're not spending time firing back, but will give you more research. Taking a picture while they're dead won't give as much, but it's also safer. This research allows you to get certain tonics, improve damage against the enemies you photograph, and overall help you deal with enemies in general. All that I've just described might sound complicated with too much to keep track of, but it's really not that bad in practice. In fact, my only real gripe with these side elements isn't that they're necessarily bad, the hacking minigame is the only one that gets repetitive, but rather that they exist in the first place. In-game economies are interesting in theory, but in practice, I prefer when games don't include them. The reason for this is because I feel it can sometimes mess with the game's balance and make it harder to figure out why exactly you're having problems if and when they arise. Am I getting my butt kicked because I'm bad at first-person shooters, or because I haven't haggled with the electronics enough, or because I haven't found enough of the right ammo type, or because I haven't been using my camera enough, or because the balance is messed up, or insert whatever gripe you might have here. My suspicions are somewhat confirmed by the fact that the level design is, well, okay. You do have oil slick to light fire and water to zap people, but beyond that, the levels are usually just moving from room to room, shooting more baddies in your way. There aren't very many places where you get to learn how to effectively use everything, in part because the game isn't always sure when you'll get certain powers, especially some of the later plasmids. You can only have a limited number of plasmids equipped at any given time, which means that the level design can't handle every possible case without either having difficulty spikes or being relatively generic. In this case, they went with the latter. The aesthetic is great and the lighting is good, but the level design isn't all that interesting, and that's without throwing in the ridiculously confusing map. The enemy variety is also only serviceable, as it's relatively interesting at first but doesn't throw anything new at you in the second half. All that happens is some of the default enemies from earlier become tougher and you get a couple new ways to kill them, which isn't nearly as interesting and frankly feels lazy. This all becomes even worse when you get into hard mode. The game is absolutely unforgiving, which would be great if it felt like I had more of a chance, but instead it feels like I have to abuse the fact that there's no penalty for dying apart from having to walk through somewhere a bunch, if that, over and over. In a game with tight gunplay or amazing level design, I could pass this off as me just being bad, but trying to fight a big daddy in hard mode is infuriating, and even then there's no way to dodge the shots when you want to come out and fight it without the decoy plasmid, which you don't get before seeing one of them, and even then you have to give up on another useful plasmid, and I'm getting off topic here because it was infuriating. I will fully admit that I didn't even get through a third of my hard mode playthrough because it simply wasn't fun anymore. I could keep getting my butt kicked and eventually figure out maybe where I went wrong, or I could be doing something more interesting. The story and atmosphere was the main gripping point for me, and with that mostly figured out in my first run, I couldn't be bothered to keep bashing my head against the wall. If I wanted that, I would go play a Diablo-style game. Sure, there's no penalty for dying, but when something like that is in place, where you basically can't lose if you're stubborn enough, it does make me scratch my head and wonder if the balance is actually aligned the way it should be. The only time that you can legitimately lose is in the final boss fight, but even then, it wasn't really a tough boss fight, and the only reason the ending was satisfying was because of the story build-up. It might be possible to die over and over without penalty outside of that, but that doesn't mean we should feel compelled to just in case you don't give us enough resources along the way. I will be honest, my first impression of this game was not a good one, and for two main reasons. First, the game doesn't have a proper field of view slider. I'm not usually one who struggles with simulation sickness, but especially while playing at night, I did feel more disoriented and a little dizzy until I found out how to change it. And even then, it likes to reset itself when you switch away from the pseudo cutscenes or go to a new area. Second, inventory management is unintuitive at best. To switch between plasmids and other weapons, you use the right mouse button. To select specific weapons, the F keys are used for plasmids and the number keys for weapons. The problem is that they're using the same numbers to represent them, so I often found myself right-clicking to switch to a plasmid, and then hitting a number expecting a plasmid and getting a weapon. There are ways around this, but neither one is ideal. Using the mouse scroll can work if you're in the right selection menu, but it can be unreliable or take longer than it should depending on your mouse. Finding the specific hotkey on your keyboard can work, but then you're looking away from your screen to find a button while in the middle of combat, not even getting into how it takes your hand off of your movement keys. We can hit the shift button to switch over to anything we want, but that takes us right out of the action and immersion, which is also not ideal. It feels like a menu that was designed for a controller, which is obviously not something I want since I can't stand how FPS games handle with one. Hell, that might be when the gunplay doesn't feel quite right either, because obviously knowing how to aim isn't something console gamers pride themselves on. It wasn't until the story threw a really good curveball and I gave myself more time to figure it out that I truly started to appreciate the game. The weapon variety is really good, even if the gunplay could be better, and the later weapons are very satisfying to use. Who needs to snap your fingers when you have a flamethrower? Burn! As for the graphics and aesthetic, there is a decent amount of detail packed into these environments, and even though getting it at 60 FPS while recording was hard on my potato of a PC, when I wasn't recording it ran fairly well. The aesthetic captures the 60s really well, as every weapon, room, and so on speaks of what looks like an idealized utopia for that time. Well, if it weren't covered in wreckage, blood, dead people, and splicers trying to kill you. The audio is really well done, with its main strength lying in its authenticity. Everything sounds like it should, and everything sounds distinct enough to help you clue in on what's going on. The music is really nice too, although given it's licensed music, I can't play any of it for you without talking over it, as the copyright gods are a bunch of jerks who hate everything good in the world. Overall, I can definitely see why people enjoyed this game, and why so many people talked about it. If nothing else, I'm glad that I can actually talk about it now without having to base my opinion off of secondhand information. However, the gameplay almost made me give up on it, and did make me give up on it for hard mode. I respect what it was trying to do and understand why they designed it in that way, but I cannot respect its execution, and I didn't enjoy the effect it had on the game balance. So the recommendation comes down to this. Can you put up with less than stellar gunplay and questionable balance for a great story, great characters, and an interesting dystopian setting at the bottom of the sea? If so, then by all means, give it a try. If you're here for the mechanical prowess, then you're probably better off looking elsewhere. I enjoyed my time with it, but I have no interest in replaying it, and even if I did, the replay value isn't that great, apart from the higher difficulty, seeing how the moral choice in the game affects the end, and for finding the last of the audio diaries scattered about Rapture. I'm glad I played it, and it didn't overstay its welcome, but I'm also glad to be done with it. That's all I have for this video. Thank you all for watching. Would you kindly like and share this video if you find it worthy, and keep an eye on this channel for the next game in Through the Looking Glass, as well as other content posted on a not-so-regular basis. I can't play any music for an outro without the copyright gods striking, so here's a catchy song by Brentalfloss instead. Enjoy.
Won't you come on down to Rapture? Jam a needle in your arm. It'll slowly corrode your genetical code, but it's all part of the charm. So you're a gross abomination, but in time you're gonna be so glad you came on down to the best little town at the bottom of the deep blue sea. Hop in the bathysphere, take in the atmosphere. It's like New York, but with more fish. This unholy demon spawn looks like Joan Rivers in the morning, but down here, she's quite a dish.